Serena Williams is one of the greatest icons that American sports has ever produced, not just because of the number of titles, but because of her unprecedented level of dominance. Serena Williams won 23 Grand Slam singles titles, the most in the Open era, a number that places her above almost every rival in the history of women's tennis. She held the world number one ranking for a total of 319 weeks, including 186 consecutive weeks, and she was the face that defined an entire era of a sport that's brutal and merciless in weeding out competitors. Serena won 4 Olympic gold medals, 14 Grand Slam doubles titles with her sister Venus, more than 94 WTA titles, and became the highest-earning female athlete in sports history. She won on every surface, defeated multiple generations of opponents, and returned to the top after injuries, after illness, after pregnancy, in circumstances where most other athletes would have been forced to stop. Serena didn't just win, she dominated, forcing the entire system to readjust standards for strength, fitness, and mental toughness in a female athlete. The trophies, the records, the award ceremonies turned her into the image of invincibility, a monument the world is used to seeing, standing tall, raising victory high, without trembling, without hesitation, without falling. But precisely when the spotlight and glory are piled so high, another life quietly exists behind it. Behind the titles is a woman who has lived for more than 20 years in constant physical pain, in anxieties no one sees, in the feeling of always being watched, judged, and demanded to be stronger than any human can endure. Serena steps onto the court with a smile and confidence, but behind the scenes is the fear of her body collapsing, the memory of coming close to death from a pulmonary embolism, the life or death trauma after giving birth, the loneliness of a black woman labeled aggressive every time she shows emotion. She learned to hide pain, hide fear, hide her own vulnerability, because the world doesn't allow the symbol of strength to be weak. One life is victory in public, one life is silent endurance, and it is that unbreakable will, that refusal to let go or break, that forced Serena to keep standing, not because she doesn't hurt, but because she understood that if she fell, no one would be ready to catch her. If you want to understand what created an invincible Serena Williams and the price she paid for every single one of those victories, please subscribe to the channel to continue following this story. Serena Williams grew up in Compton, California, a place where childhood wasn't defined by innocence, but by the ability to survive. There, cracked streets and poor neighborhoods didn't teach kids how to dream. They taught them how to watch, how to dodge, and how to stay silent when necessary. Serena Williams was born into an environment where police sirens, helicopters, and even gunshots weren't rare, and that instability sank deep into her memory before she could even understand what safety meant. The Williams family lived amid poverty and constant tension, where every passing day carried the question of whether tomorrow would be any better. In that environment, kids weren't allowed to be weak, because weakness meant danger. Serena learned to be on guard before she learned to play, learned to protect herself before she learned to trust. Tennis came to her not as a game that brought joy, but as a way out of Compton, the only escape route her family could hold on to. Her father saw in the racket a narrow but real path, and from that moment, Serena's life entered an orbit that allowed no deviation. Practices took place on worn-out public courts, where the surfaces were cracked and the surroundings were never truly safe. There were days when training was interrupted by incidents that would terrify an ordinary child. But for Serena, that fear became so familiar, it no longer had a name. She learned to stand on the court with absolute focus, not because of passion, but because she understood this was the only road to keep from being swallowed by circumstances. Discipline came before joy, orders came before feelings, and every shot was repeated not to perfect technique, but so her body would remember it couldn't stop. Serena didn't have a prolonged childhood, because her family had no room for slowness. While other kids were allowed to fail, allowed to change, Serena was taught that every mistake had a cost, and that cost could mean going back to square one. The fear of losing took root before talent could even bloom, turning into a rough but enduring drive. She didn't fear losing for pride. She feared losing because failure meant all her family's efforts would become meaningless. Every practice session under the blazing sun didn't just build fitness, it built her ability to endure pain in silence. Serena learned to grit her teeth and bear it before she ever knew the feeling of winning, learned to swallow tears before she learned to celebrate. In Compton, softness wasn't encouraged, and Serena grew up believing that to survive, she had to be stronger than necessary. That very environment created a child who matured too early, carrying the expectations of her entire family and a survival plan laid out long before. Tennis didn't bring Serena glittering dreams. It brought her a path, and that path was so narrow it didn't allow turning back. Her childhood was cut short by responsibility and fear, by the feeling that she had no right to be tired or hesitant. And even though the world later called her the symbol of strength, deep inside, the memory of Compton still lingers like a cold reminder that everything she achieved came from a place that was never kind, a place where she learned to stand firm, not because of confidence, but because if she fell, no one would catch her. The Williams family was not a peaceful home where children were allowed to grow up at their own natural pace, but a system built around a single goal: escaping poverty through success. At the center of that system was Richard Williams, the father who served both as protector and as the absolute authority over his daughters' lives. He viewed the world through the eyes of a black man who had lived long enough to understand that this society would never show leniency to the disadvantaged. In Richard's thinking, if his children wanted to survive, wanted to rise up, they could not be allowed to be like other kids. And so, from when Serena was very young, her life was already scripted with no room for improvisation. Training hours, daily routines, how to behave in front of outsiders, everything fell under the strict control of a father who believed only iron discipline could create a different future for the family. Richard didn't just teach his children how to play tennis, he taught them how to confront the world, taught them that mistakes were not lessons, but dangers. In that family, failure was not seen as a necessary experience, but as something unacceptable. Serena grew up with the feeling that she could not disappoint her father, could not let that plan fall apart, because behind every shot she hit was an entire family depending on her. Richard protected his children from outside traps, from discrimination, from forces that could exploit or hurt them. But at the same time, he built an invisible wall of pressure where love always came with conditions. Serena learned to read her father's facial expressions before she learned to listen to herself, learned to meet demands before she learned to ask questions. In that environment, personal emotions held little value because the most important thing was results. Richard believed the world would not care about his children's fears, and so he did not allow them to linger too long. Serena was not taught how to handle failure because in the pre-written script, failure had no place. She was taught that to survive, to be respected, she had to win, had to stand above others, had to prove her worth with undeniable victories. Serena learned to win very early, but no one taught her how to face her own vulnerability. When she was tired, she was told to push harder. When she was in pain, she was reminded that others hurt more. When she was afraid, she was told that fear was a luxury. The Williams family operated like a survival machine, where each member had a specific role, and Serena gradually understood that she was an irreplaceable part of that plan. She loved her father, but she also grew up in unspoken tension, in the feeling that love was always tied to achievement. Serena had no space to be weak, because weakness meant slowing down the whole train, speeding forward. The long training sessions, the strict demands, the non-stop reminders created a girl with extraordinary endurance. but at the same time stripped away her right to stumble like a normal child. In that family, Serena learned that her value lay in fulfilling the assigned role, in not deviating from the script. She grew up with the awareness that if she stopped, if she weakened, the entire structure her father had built could collapse. Richard Williams was not a blindly authoritarian figure. He acted out of fear and a distorted love from a father who wanted to protect his children from a cruel world. But it was precisely that combination of protection and imposition that created an environment where Serena was forced to mature too early. She learned to control her emotions, hide her exhaustion, and keep moving forward even when her body and mind screamed for rest. In the Williams family, no one said it out loud, but Serena understood very clearly that she was not allowed to fail. Not because failure was bad, but because failure meant going back to the starting line, back to a life the family had risked everything to escape. And so, Serena learned to win in every circumstance, but she never had the chance to learn how to accept vulnerability as a natural part of being human. The toughness the world later saw was not an innate quality, but the product of a childhood placed in a strict framework where success was the only path allowed to exist. The family created Serena Williams, but it was also that family that planted in her a deep belief that only by standing firm and winning did she have the right to remain in this world. Venus Williams was the first light in Serena's life, not just because she came first on the tennis court, but because Venus was the one who opened up the possibility that their family could exist on a different path. When Serena was still a little girl standing on the sidelines of practice, the one who was seen, called by name, and expected from first was always Venus. Venus Williams was older, taller, one step ahead, and in the eyes of the world, she was proof that the Williams family plan could succeed. Serena grew up in absolute admiration for her big sister, but also in an unavoidable reality. All initial attention went to Venus. That shadow was not a place Serena could step out of, because it was not just the shadow of success, but also the shadow of family bonds. Serena did not compete with Venus to surpass her. She existed in a painful state of contradiction, wanting to be like her sister, while fearing that becoming better than her would break something sacred that could not be named. When Serena began to pull ahead, when the victories came more often, faster, and more fiercely, the relationship between the two sisters entered uncharted territory for which no one had prepared a map. On the court, they were merciless opponents, forced to face each other in front of millions of eyes, in finals that the whole world treated like sports festivals. But after every shot, after every point, there was a silent cut in Serena's heart. Every time she defeated Venus, she did not feel complete joy in victory, but felt as if she had just taken something away from the one person who had gone through their harsh childhood with her. Serena could not celebrate like other athletes because the loser was not a stranger, but her sister, the one who had sheltered, guided, and shared every family pressure from the beginning. Family ties in the Williams household were never simple, because they were placed under the spotlight of comparison, media, and public expectations. The world did not see the two sisters as two individuals, but as two symbols forced to confront each other to create a story. Serena was pulled out from Venus's shadow by the very victories over her sister, but the price paid was a lingering guilt, a pain with no place for release. She could not refuse to compete, could not step aside, because both of their careers were built on proving that the Williams family was not a fleeting phenomenon. But because of that, Serena never truly escaped that shadow. Even with more titles, even being called the greatest, she still carried inside her the memory of a little sister standing behind, always looking to Venus as an emotional anchor. Every match between the two sisters was a moment where fate and family bonds mixed, creating a pain no outsider could understand. Serena was forced to be stronger, colder, because if she let her emotions show, both sisters would be swept into an endless cycle of judgment. She learned to hide her softness even from Venus, because one sister's weakness would become a burden for the other. In those years, Serena was not only fighting opponents on the court, but also fighting herself, with the nagging question of whether her success was hurting the person she loved most. The bond between Serena and Venus was never broken, but it was placed under the weight of destiny, where neither had the right to choose their roles. Serena could not step out of Venus's shadow, because that shadow was not just success. It was memory, childhood, everything they had endured together. And so, every victory over her sister was never just a career milestone, but a quiet cut, reminding Serena that the path to her greatness was paved with pains that no title could ever soothe. When Serena Williams began to dominate women's tennis, the world witnessed a phenomenon that the system was never prepared to accept. Serena Williams didn't just win, she dominated. She didn't just surpass her opponents. She exposed every limit that women's tennis had ever imposed on itself. Her serves carried an unprecedented weight. Her movements were full of power. Her ability to finish points was cold and decisive, leaving opponents no time to breathe. Serena entered every tournament with the posture of someone who could take it all, and she did so consistently enough that victory became her default state. But it was from that very moment that a cruel paradox began to form. The world celebrates the dominator, but it was not ready to accept the form of that dominator when that person was a black woman who was too strong. What was praised as composure in male athletes suddenly became a problem when it appeared in Serena. Every scream of release after a tense point was scrutinized as uncontrolled behavior. Every frown, every emotional reaction was exaggerated into evidence of aggressiveness. Serena was not allowed to get angry like others, because her anger was assigned long-standing prejudices that society had never truly abandoned. Her physical strength, instead of being seen as the result of discipline and hard work, was distorted into something threatening, even frightening. She was asked if she was too masculine, if that body was too different from what people were used to accepting. Those questions were not meant to understand, but to put Serena in a position where she had to justify her very existence. Her emotions were criminalized bit by bit, as if every instinctive reaction was evidence of some nameless crime. While her opponents were allowed to express personality, Serena was required to restrain herself, to soften, to be strong enough to win, but not so strong that it made others uncomfortable. She was forced to carry the responsibility of representing an entire community, while no one gave her the right to be an individual with complex emotions. Serena stepped onto the court not just to win a tennis match, but to defend herself against the suspicious gaze of an entire system. Every one of her victories was not only analyzed technically, but dissected for attitude, for expression, for the way she existed in that space. Gradually, Serena's strength was no longer seen as something admirable, but as something that needed to be controlled. She was reminded to behave properly, a vague but powerful phrase often used to force people like her to shrink themselves. Serena learned to win in a context where every display of emotion could be turned against her. She had to weigh every reaction, every gesture, because just one unguarded moment and the whole world was ready to dismiss her efforts with a simple label: aggressive. The most painful thing was not the individual criticisms, but the feeling that she was never allowed to fully enjoy her own achievements. When Serena won, the question was not how good she was, but how she had gone too far. Her strength became something that made others uneasy, and that unease quickly turned into hostility, disguised under the guise of standards and politeness. Serena was forced to keep winning in a space that didn't truly want her to exist in her most natural way. She understood that if she slowed down, if she weakened, the system would show no mercy. But if she kept being strong, she would be punished with isolation and suspicion. That was the trap Serena could not escape. Strength was the condition for survival, But strength was also the very reason she was seen as guilty. In that world, Serena was not just fighting opponents across the net, but an entire collective prejudice, where the strength of a black woman was viewed as something that needed to be explained, controlled, and ultimately silenced. When Serena Williams entered the phase of absolute dominance, a second life began to form in parallel, quietly and full of doubt. Serena Williams on the court was a cold, overwhelming image, almost giving her opponents no space to exist. Every serve was a declaration of power. Every point finished like an unexplained period. The world grew accustomed to seeing a Serena who didn't tremble, didn't apologize, didn't back down, and gradually, that image became a standard she was forced to maintain. But when she left the baseline, when the applause faded, and the lights no longer shone directly on her face, another Serena existed in silence, where outward confidence gave way to endless questions. She wondered how much she was hated, whether each victory was widening the gap between her and the world. Anxiety followed her even in the seemingly most peaceful moments, because Serena understood that just one slip, one mistimed emotional display, and the image she had painstakingly built would be flipped into evidence against herself. Every match was no longer simply a sporting contest, but a full-scale self-defense, where she had to protect her technique, her reputation, and even her right to exist as a human with emotions. Serena stepped onto the court, aware that every action was being scrutinized, not just by opponents or umpires, but by an entire system, always waiting for her to err so it could justify pre-existing prejudices. She had to win, but she had to win in a way that didn't make anyone uncomfortable. A vague but suffocatingly heavy demand. Outside the court, Serena lived in a state of constant alertness, as if every space could become a battlefield. Press conferences, interviews, even everyday moments carried the risk of being misinterpreted. She learned to choose her words carefully, control her expressions, limit her displays, because just one unguarded moment and a lifetime of effort could be reduced to a negative label. The loneliness didn't come from a lack of people around her, but from the feeling that no one truly saw the real person behind the invincible image. Serena could not naturally share her fears, because that fear, if spoken, would be seen as a sign of weakness the world was not ready to accept in her. She was not allowed to live like an ordinary person, because ordinary meant the right to make mistakes, to be tired, to be afraid. Rights Serena never truly had. Doubt crept into every decision, every step, making even moments of victory carry an aftertaste of unease. Serena began to measure herself not just by results, but by the crowd's reaction, by how the media would retell her story. Every time she stepped onto the court, she donned a thick layer of psychological armor, because without it, she could not stand firm against the accumulated pressure from years of scrutiny and judgment. The price of always having to be strong was never being able to relax, never truly resting in her mind. Serena lived two separate but inseparable lives. One as the icon, where she had to be perfect and unshakable, and one as a human being, where she quietly wrestled with anxiety and isolation. Those two lives collided every day, wearing each other down in silence, making Serena understand that dominance did not bring freedom, but sometimes stripped away the most basic human rights. Every match ended not just with a score on the board, but with another layer of defense in her soul, thicker, harder, and lonelier. Serena kept moving forward, not because she wasn't tired, but because stopping meant exposing the vulnerability that the world had repeatedly proven it did not want to see. Victories began piling up at a pace so fast that even Serena herself couldn't fully grasp what was happening. Serena Williams won one Grand Slam after another, breaking records and then setting new milestones for herself. And the world gradually grew accustomed to viewing her dominance as something inevitable. With each passing season, her list of achievements grew longer. The numbers were repeated endlessly in the media. and the image of Serena raising the trophy high became part of our collective memory. But in the very moment when outsiders saw the peak of glory, an invisible burden was quietly pressing down on her shoulders. There was no pause to savor the victory, because the moment one win ended, the next question immediately appeared. When would she win again? And could she keep it up? Serena was not allowed to stop and feel the joy, because joy was considered a luxury in a world that had grown used to demanding she keep winning. Grand slams were no longer goals to strive for, but obligations to fulfill, a standard that, if unmet, would make her look like she was declining. Each new title didn't bring a sense of release, but dragged along a new layer of expectation, heavier, stricter, and less forgiving. Serena began to feel that her success wasn't creating safety, but instead making the space around her narrower and narrower. When she won, the world demanded more. When she didn't win overwhelmingly enough, the world questioned. She was caught in an inescapable loop, where victory was no longer a reward, but the condition for continuing to exist in her role as an icon. Serena no longer won for the joy of competing or for pure personal ambition. She won because she understood that losing would not be seen as a normal outcome, but as a sign of decline, as proof she no longer deserved the position she held. That pressure made every match heavier than before, because failure wasn't just losing a tennis match, it was losing the right to be seen as invincible. Serena began stepping onto the court, aware that she was defending a legacy that wasn't yet finished, a legacy the world kept measuring by new trophies. She wasn't allowed to play just to experiment, to make mistakes, to learn like other athletes, because every move she made was placed under a microscope. Victory, instead of bringing freedom, bound Serena to a role she couldn't shed. The moments of celebration became brief, almost mechanical, because in her mind, the next schedule, the next tournament, the next challenge had already appeared. Serena understood that if she slowed down even for a beat, the world wouldn't wait. It would immediately start looking for a successor. The exhaustion didn't come only from a body worn down over the years, but from the feeling that her every effort was never enough. Each victory was recorded, but immediately set aside to make room for the next demand. Serena had no privilege of being satisfied with herself, because satisfaction equaled complacency in others' eyes. She began to understand that success was no longer a path to peace, but a path to constant vigilance. The award ceremonies, the applause, the praise, couldn't erase the truth that inside she was growing increasingly tired of the very role she carried. Serena kept winning not because she always wanted to win, but because she knew that losing would bring judgments only she would have to bear. In that world, victory became the only shield for self-protection, and as that shield grew heavier with each title, Serena was forced to keep carrying it forward even as her hands began to tremble. Serena Williams's body didn't betray her in a single moment. It betrayed her gradually, silently, across seasons that stretched beyond human endurance. Serena Williams lived for many years in pain the public never saw. Pains dismissed as part of the game, injuries suppressed with medication, with willpower, with the belief that just pushing a little more would make it pass. Tendons, muscles, knees, back, ankles, all bore the marks of thousands of hours of relentless training and competition. But Serena didn't allow herself to stop, because stopping meant exposing the weakness the world had long been waiting for. She kept stepping onto the court with her familiar smile and confidence, hiding the pain as if it were a private secret she wasn't allowed to reveal. Chronic injuries became part of daily life, and Serena learned to live with them as though pain was the price to pay to keep existing in her invincible role. But in 2011, her body no longer accepted the compromise. After a surgery, and what seemed like a normal recovery, Serena suddenly faced an event no title could protect her from. A pulmonary embolism. Blood clots moved through her body, silent and deadly, making every breath labored, every chest pain a warning that death was very close. For the first time in her life, Serena wasn't facing the possibility of losing a match. She was facing the possibility of no tomorrow. The hospital replaced the court, breathing tubes replaced the racket, and helplessness replaced the sense of control she had known for so many years. In those moments, the physical strength that once terrified the world became meaningless because her body no longer obeyed the commands of her will. Serena understood she could die, not in a dramatic match, but quietly, on a hospital bed, with no audience, no applause. The risk of death was real, not a metaphor, not a story exaggerated for the media. She had to confront the stark truth that everything she had built could end right there, without a goodbye, without closing a chapter. But even in that situation, Serena stayed silent in public. When she reappeared, the familiar smile was still there, as if it had all been just a short break. The world saw a strong Serena returning after illness, praising her as a symbol of resilience. But behind that smile was a new fear, deeper and colder than any before. Serena began living with the awareness that her body could betray her at any moment, that even a small pain could signal an impending disaster. She returned to the court, kept winning, but now every match carried a silent question. Could this body still endure? The fear of death wasn't allowed to show on her face because a frightened Serena was something the world wouldn't accept. She hid the sleepless nights, the moments of panic when she felt her heartbeat skip, the thoughts of death she had never before allowed herself to entertain. Serena kept training, kept competing, as though maintaining the familiar rhythm could somehow control her fate. But inside, a line had been crossed. She was no longer immortal in her own mind. Each victory after that ordeal no longer carried the pure meaning of sport, but became a way to affirm that she was still alive, still here. Serena didn't speak about that fear because speaking it would mean admitting vulnerability, and that vulnerability could be used to deny everything she had achieved. She chose to smile, chose to keep stepping onto the court as though death were just a shadow behind her. But that very silence made the burden heavier, because now Serena wasn't just fighting opponents and prejudice, she was fighting her own body. The body that once carried her to the top had become the thing that kept her perpetually on guard. Every tournament was a test, not just of skill, but of survival. Serena understood that if she stopped out of fear, the world wouldn't wait. But if she continued, she was gambling with her own life. And in that paradox, Serena kept moving forward not because she didn't know fear, but because she had grown used to hiding her fear behind a victorious smile. Returning after that life-or-death ordeal, Serena Williams was celebrated as a living miracle, proof of iron will and superhuman strength. Serena Williams reappeared on the court to prolonged applause, in headlines praising a comeback few athletes had ever achieved. The world saw a Serena standing tall, competing, winning again, and quickly restored the familiar narrative of invincibility. But behind that comeback was a truth few wanted to face. Serena's body was never whole again. The damage didn't disappear. It simply shifted from acute episodes to a permanent state, following her through every practice, every movement, every seemingly routine shot. Pain was no longer an unusual event, but the foundation of her competitive life, a silent yet persistent presence reminding Serena that the line between life and death remained very close. She returned to the court with a new caution, aware that every match was a test of her body's endurance. The pain was no longer seen as an obstacle to overcome, but as warning signs she was forced to listen to, even though she had no right to stop. Serena understood that the miracle image the world loved did not reflect the reality she was living. Every time she stepped onto the court, she wasn't just competing against opponents, she was negotiating with her own body, weighing how much it could endure that day. Serena's double life entered its most destructive phase, because the gap between her public image and personal experience grew wider and wider. In the press, she was the symbol of resurrection, of defeating illness through sheer will. But in the locker room, during long therapy sessions, during sleepless nights from aching pain, Serena faced the truth that the cost of continuing to compete was growing higher every day. Pain became a constant state, not just physical, but mental too. She had to learn to accept that her body no longer obeyed commands like before, that every slip, every strange sensation could carry the fear of a new crisis. Serena still won, still went deep in major tournaments, but those victories no longer brought relief. They came with accumulated exhaustion, with the worry that her body was wearing down faster than it could recover. The world kept demanding she return to her previous peak, prove that the comeback was not just a moment, but a lasting affirmation. But inside, Serena understood there was no complete return, only different ways of existing after damage. She lived in constant tension, because if she showed fatigue, the miracle story would collapse, and with it, the position she had sacrificed so much to hold. The double life was no longer a clear separation between on-court and off-court. It became a constant overlap, where physical pain seeped into every public moment. Serena had to hide her new limitations, adjust her game, conserve energy, but she could never let opponents or the public realize she was weakening. She competed knowing that every tournament might be her last at this level, but she could not say it out loud. Silence became a survival strategy because speaking would hand the world a reason to doubt and discard her. The praise kept coming, but it grew further and further from Serena's real feelings. She no longer sought validation. She only sought to keep her body well enough to play one more match, one more round. The comeback did not bring healing. It opened a new chapter of prolonged endurance. Serena entered a phase where every victory carried the question of its cost, and every potential loss risked being interpreted as proof of decline. In that context, her double life reached its peak of destruction, when the gap between icon and real human became impossible to bridge. Serena kept stepping onto the court not because she believed she had fully recovered, but because she understood that stopping would not bring release either. And in that very paradox, Serena's comeback, though hailed as a miracle, became a journey that never truly healed, where pain was the foundation every subsequent effort had to stand on. Becoming a mother should have been a moment filled with hope and renewal, but for Serena Williams, it opened one of the most terrifying experiences of her life, where strength, fame, and every previous victory became meaningless. Serena Williams entered pregnancy believing she had overcome too much to be defeated by this. She had faced injuries, illness, the pressure of an entire system, and always risen again. But this time was different. This time, the opponent wasn't across the net. It was her own body, and the medical system she trusted to protect her. Serena's childbirth did not unfold as a peaceful story. It came with complications, with abnormal signs she felt clearly, because Serena knew her body better than anyone after decades of living with pain. Right after giving birth, she felt shortness of breath, the familiar but terrifying sensation of the pains that had once signaled a pulmonary embolism. Serena voiced her concerns, demanded checks, demanded scans, demanded to be heard. But for the first time in her life, her voice carried no power. Her worries were downplayed, dismissed as overreaction, as postpartum anxiety from a new mother. The doctors didn't believe her, didn't act immediately, and in that brief window, Serena's life hung on the thinnest thread. Blood clots began forming, threatening to travel to her lungs, following the exact script that had nearly taken her life years earlier. When the truth was finally discovered, everything turned chaotic. Emergency surgery, tubes, waves of intense pain, and a body that had just gone through childbirth, forced to endure even more severe trauma. Serena faced the possibility of death not on the court, not in a glorious moment, but on a hospital bed in the weakest state she had ever known. For the first time, Serena understood complete helplessness. She could not use willpower to control the situation, could not use fame to demand safety, could not use strength to stand up and keep going. Everything was out of her hands, and that very helplessness made the fear deeper than any injury before. Serena didn't just fear dying, she feared leaving without getting to be a mother, without fully living the role she had just entered. When the crisis passed, Serena's body was left with new wounds, both visible and invisible. She had to recover from childbirth while recovering from a life-threatening surgery. The pains layered on top of each other, the mobility restrictions, and a mind haunted by the question of what would have happened if she hadn't been saved in time. But what hurt Serena more than the near-death experience itself was the cold realization that even someone like her could be dismissed to the point of danger. For the first time, Serena was not seen as an icon to protect, but as a patient not to be trusted. That shook the belief she once had in her ability to control her own fate. When she returned home, holding her child in her arms, Serena understood she had entered a different chapter of life, where victory was no longer measured by titles, but by staying alive to remain present. But alongside the joy of motherhood came a constant fear that her body had betrayed her once again, and this time the consequences had nearly been permanent. Serena had to learn to care for a new life, while she herself had not yet recovered, had to hide her fears so as not to panic her family, had to keep showing a calm face to the public. The world only saw the image of a strong mother returning, but no one saw the nights. Serena woke up, haunted, short of breath, reliving the memory of not being believed when her life was threatened. For the first time in her life, Serena could not rely solely on her own strength to overcome everything completely. She was forced to admit that there are moments when, even after conquering the world, a person can still be placed in complete vulnerability. That experience left a deep scar in Serena, not just physically but in how she viewed herself and the world around her. It marked the point where her double life moved to another level, where even the role of mother did not bring absolute safety. Serena kept living, kept recovering, kept appearing in public with her familiar composure. But inside, she carried the memory of the moment she nearly vanished from this life simply because her voice was not heard. And from that moment on, Serena understood that the greatest strength she ever had was not her ability to dominate on the court, but surviving the moments when everything slipped beyond control, to keep being present for her child, for her family, and for herself, in a world that had never truly been safe. Returning to the court after becoming a mother was not a glorious comeback, but a heavy decision made in a state of never having fully recovered. Serena Williams stepped onto the court with a body still bearing the marks of that life-or-death ordeal, with pains that had not yet subsided, and a mind perpetually on high alert. The world saw a Serena returning to training, returning to competition, as though sheer will could compensate for every injury. But inside, she understood very clearly that she was walking on fragile ground, where every step forward could bring unpredictable consequences. Coming back before full recovery was not a choice born of confidence, but the choice of someone long accustomed to never allowing herself to stop. Serena carried guilt from the very moment of that decision, because at home was a young child who needed her care, while out there was a world still demanding she appear as the invincible icon. She was trapped between two roles that allowed no compromise: a mother expected to be fully present, and a sports legend forced to prove she had not weakened at all. Serena tried to fulfill both, but every effort brought the feeling that she was falling short somewhere. When she trained, she felt she was missing irreplaceable moments with her child. When she was with her child, part of her worried that her career was slipping away. No moment brought complete peace, because absence existed everywhere, impossible to fill. On the court, Serena faced not only opponents but her own unprepared body, with the fear that a sudden pain could end everything. She competed in a state of both wanting to prove herself and wanting to protect herself. a tension that made every match more exhausting than before. Off the court, she lived with the feeling that she was never a good enough mother by the invisible standards society set. Serena was scrutinized for every choice, from returning too soon to not being with her child enough, as though no decision could ever be right. She realized that fame did not bring leniency, but instead magnified every shortcoming. The guilt followed her through every ordinary moment, making even small joys feel fleeting. Serena tried to be present for her child, but her mind kept drifting to the schedule, to the demands of her career. She tried to be present for her career, but her heart stayed at home, where a completely dependent little life waited. Those two worlds did not merge. They constantly pulled her in opposite directions, leaving Serena always feeling like she was in the wrong place. No role felt complete, because each demanded a part of her she could not give without losing the other. The exhaustion came not only from the physical, but from the sense that every choice came with sacrifice, and that sacrifice was never fully acknowledged. Serena understood she was living in a paradox few truly comprehended. The harder she tried, the more inadequate she felt. Every win did not erase the feeling that she was not good enough as a mother. Every moment with her child did not soothe the worry that she was losing something in her career. She was trapped in an inescapable loop of guilt, with no clear stopping point to breathe. Serena kept moving forward, not because she had found balance, but because she did not know what else to do. The world continued to praise her will and her comeback, but rarely did anyone ask what she had sacrificed to maintain that image. In silence, Serena carried the feeling that she always owed something to her child for the missed moments, to herself for the rest she needed, to both roles for a wholeness she could not achieve at the same time. And in that state, guilt became her most persistent companion, an invisible but ever-present burden that made every next step heavier than the last. Amid all that piled-up pressure, Serena Williams's marriage appeared as one of the rare spaces where she could lower her guard, even if just for a moment. Serena Williams entered this relationship not as an icon to be conquered or a legend to be tamed, but as a human being exhausted from having to prove her worth to the entire world. Alexis Ohanian did not come into Serena's life expecting to control, to fix, or to stand in her spotlight. With him, Serena did not need to win, did not need to appear strong, did not need to explain why she was tired or why she was afraid. This was one of the rare times in her life when she was not placed into a pre-written role. There was no demand to shrink to fit or pressure to grow larger to deserve it. The normalcy of this relationship became extraordinary for Serena, because she was used to every relationship being tied to achievement, expectations, and the public gaze. In the family space, she was allowed to exist without defense, allowed to voice her worries without fear they would become proof of weakness. But even that refuge could not erase the exhaustion accumulated over decades. Marriage was not a miracle that could instantly remove the layers of armor Serena had worn since childhood. The anxieties, the self-protective habits, the survival reflexes remained, even when no longer necessary. Serena could be loved without proving anything, but that did not mean she could stop demanding perfection from herself. She carried the scars of a life always under scrutiny, and those scars did not vanish just because the surrounding environment had become safer. In marriage, Serena found understanding and respect, but she also realized that her burnout did not come from the present, but from a past that had lasted too long. Quiet nights with family were still interrupted by uninvited thoughts about her career, responsibilities, and whether she was doing enough. Marriage became the place where she could breathe, but only in short, necessary breaths to keep going. It could not fully compensate for the years lived in constant vigilance, could not erase the feeling that she always had to be ready for the next worst thing. Serena loved, and was loved in a relationship without imposition, but that did not immediately lighten the inner burden. This refuge was not the final destination, but a temporary stop where she could set down part of her worry before picking it up again. In that space, Serena learned to accept that she did not need to be strong all the time, but she also gradually understood that learning vulnerability would be a longer journey than any sports career. Marriage gave her an anchor, but it did not erase the reality that exhaustion had seeped into every habit, every reflex. Serena was no longer as alone as before, but she still had to face herself, with unanswered questions about balance and whether a state of wholeness existed for someone accustomed to living under pressure. And so, marriage became the only place where she could breathe, not to heal completely, but to survive. One more stretch in a life that had already worn her down too much. Serena Williams's decision to leave tennis did not come as a bold declaration or a carefully prepared farewell. It arrived quietly, built from countless signals her body and mind had been sending for too long. Serena did not leave the court because she ran out of ability. Even in her final appearances, she still had enough power to make opponents wary, still capable of exploding in moments that transcended time. What forced her to stop was the feeling that every next step was pushing her closer to an irreversible limit. Her body was no longer a reliable ally. It reacted slower, hurt longer, recovered with greater difficulty. Long training sessions left consequences that no longer vanished after a night's sleep. Her mind, too, had no more room for excitement, only a list of things she would have to endure if she continued. Serena understood that continuing was no longer courageous but self-destructive, trading health, family, and the fragile peace she had just begun to touch. She weighed this decision in prolonged inner conflict. Tennis was not just a profession. It was the only language Serena had used to communicate with the world since she was very young. Leaving tennis meant letting go of the identity that had shaped her entire life. But at that point, every choice carried the taste of loss. If she stayed, she would continue living in the loop of pain, pressure, and endless demands. If she left, she would face a massive void, with no schedule to shield her, no short-term goals to delay questions about herself. Serena realized there was no perfect escape. All she could choose was the path least cruel to herself. That decision, therefore, was not surrender in the face of failure, but an acknowledgement of human limits after so many years of living beyond them. Serena had spent the vast majority of her life proving she could endure more than anyone else, that willpower could overpower the body. But by this point, she understood that forcing it further would only cause everything to shatter in ways that could never be repaired. Leaving became a necessary surrender, not to abandon her worth, but to preserve what remained of her life. It was one of the rare moments when Serena allowed herself to ask not how many more wins she could claim, but how she could go on living. The way Serena spoke about her departure reflected that clearly. She did not use the word retire like a door slamming shut. Instead, she chose language that framed it as a transition, a moving away towards something else. That wording was not meant to dodge reality, but to leave herself a gentler path after so many years of having to be rigid. Serena did not want to portray herself as a victim of time, nor did she want to play the role of the ultimate victor. She simply wanted permission to stop without being questioned, without being required to prove anything more. In the silence of that decision lay a very real sadness, because tennis was where she had poured her entire youth, where the strongest emotions of her life had once existed. But that sadness came with a quiet relief, because finally, she no longer had to wake up every day feeling she was risking too much just to meet an old expectation. Leaving tennis did not erase the accumulated pain, nor did it instantly bring peace. It only ended the long chain of days when every step onto the court was another gamble with her body and mind. Serena accepted that some battles should not be prolonged, and sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to stop. She did not need a perfect farewell match to affirm her place in history. What she had already done was enough to stand firm without any further proof. The decision to leave, therefore, was a belated but necessary act of self-protection, Serena's choice of long-term survival over short-term glory. In that withdrawal, there were no fireworks, no climactic moment for the crowd to erupt, only a woman looking back at the road she had traveled, realizing she had paid enough for every victory and no longer had any obligation to pay more. Serena walked away from tennis not because she no longer loved the sport, but because she loved herself and her family enough not to keep destroying herself. It was a heavy decision that brought no sense of triumph, but it opened the chance to exist with less pain. And in a world accustomed to seeing Serena as invincible, the moment she stopped, not out of weakness, but because of limits, became her final affirmation of honesty with herself. When Serena Williams left the court behind, the double life that had followed her for more than 2 decades began to close in a way emptier than any defeat she had ever known. Serena Williams was no longer the invincible icon standing under the lights, no longer the woman whose every move was measured by titles and expectations. The court, once the only space that allowed her to exist with full strength and purpose, suddenly vanished from her daily rhythm. No more schedule to prepare for, no more opponents to face, no more moments of forcing herself to become the familiar image the world knew. In its place came a long silence, not comfortable, where Serena was forced to confront herself without the usual armor. The double life that once helped her survive no longer had a reason to exist, yet the emptiness it left behind was not easy to fill. Serena woke up on mornings without clear purpose, where her body still carried the memory of pain and her mind still defaulted to a state of alertness. The silence did not bring immediate peace, because peace was unfamiliar to someone who had lived so long under pressure. With no icon left to protect, Serena felt her own fragility keenly, not in front of opponents, but in front of questions she had never had time to answer. She wondered who she was when no longer defined by victories, when no longer required to fulfill a public role. In that silence, memories from many years flooded back, not in order, not logically, just fragments of a life that had always been pushed forward. Serena realized that for a very long time she had used victories to postpone facing herself, used busyness to avoid emptiness. When everything stopped, that emptiness appeared stark and unforgiving. With no court left to shield her, every physical pain became more pronounced, every mental worry louder. Serena no longer had to prove anything to the world, but she also no longer had anywhere to hide. That prolonged silence was not a romantic rest, but an uncomfortable phase where body and mind had to relearn how to exist without forced goals. She felt herself shrink in a strange way, not because she weakened, but because she no longer had to enlarge herself to meet expectations. Serena faced a nameless sadness, the sadness of closing a chapter so large that leaving it created an unavoidable void. The days without tennis made her understand that the double life had once kept her alive, but had also taken so much away. When those two lives merged into one, with no boundary left between icon and human being, Serena was forced to learn how to exist in a reality less dramatic, and also less protective. She was no longer required to be strong, but she was also no longer buoyed by applause. That silence stretched on, quiet, without clear markers, just the slow passage of time. Serena gradually understood that emptiness was not a sign of failure, but the natural consequence of having lived too long at extreme intensity. Facing herself in silence was a harder challenge than any match, because there were no clear rules, no scoreboard to confirm she was on the right path. She learned to accept uncertainty, learned to let days pass without needing to win. But that acceptance did not come quickly, and it did not come easily. The silence still carried restlessness, absence, and even the fear that without being defined by tennis, she might become invisible. Serena had to relearn how to see herself as a complete human being, not as a tool for producing victories. The double life closed, but its imprint remained deep, making every transition step cautious. In that emptiness, Serena did not immediately find answers. She only found the truth that life after glory is not a reward, but a new, slow, difficult journey, where she had to build meaning on her own without relying on any title. And it was precisely in that long, uncomfortable silence that Serena began to touch a different form of existence, where no longer being an icon did not mean losing value, but opened the possibility of being herself, even if at first that possibility carried far more confusion than peace. When the story comes to a close, no miracle appears to soothe the deep scars that have been etched throughout Serena Williams's entire life. Serena Williams is not healed in the way people usually expect in tales of glory. There is no complete resurrection, no final victorious moment to make all the previous pain seem worth it. What remains is an American woman standing before the rest of her life, carrying the full weight of memories from years lived beyond her limits, endured too much, and gone far past the boundaries ordinary humans are allowed to reach. Serena did not step away from the court with an intact body or a lightened mind. She stepped away with a body worn down, a spirit accustomed to vigilance, and a history that cannot be washed away by a short span of time. The silence surrounding her is not a reward, but the inevitable consequence of a life that has been too loud, too tense, too burdened by expectations and prejudice. Serena no longer has to fight, but that does not mean she finds simple happiness. The wounds do not vanish just because the race has stopped. They persist quietly, like reminders of the price of always having to be strong. She lived in a world that did not allow her to be weak, did not allow her to slow down, did not allow her to make mistakes. And because of that, being permitted to stop became a luxury Serena only earned after paying the full price. In the silence of the present, Serena is no longer measured by numbers, titles, historic wins. She is measured by her ability to keep existing after everything, by still standing even after being stretched nearly to the breaking point. There is no final victory to close the journey, because there have been too many victories, and none can erase the truth that she had to endure a life beyond limits. Serena is not healed in a romantic way. She only learns to live with what remains. And perhaps that is the most honest truth of this life. She does not need to be honored with cheers, does not need one more explosive moment to prove anything. The true honor for Serena lies in silence, in recognizing her as a human being who carried too many roles at once: athlete, icon, black woman, mother, wife, and finally herself. Serena survived not in the sense of defeating external enemies, but in the sense of getting through each day in a system that was never truly gentle with her. She endured enough not just physical injuries, but the mental wounds from being doubted, scrutinized, demanded to be perfect. And when everything closes, the most important thing is not how much she achieved, but that she is still standing there to tell the story through her very existence. Serena did not leave as a healed legend, but as a real human being, full of flaws, exhaustion, and limits. That is precisely what makes her story truer and more worthy of respect than any myth. Because some people do not live for simple happiness the way the world likes to tell. They live to endure, to pave the way, to carry burdens others never had to bear. Serena Williams is one of them. And in this final moment, when the lights have gone out, when the court is only a memory, the only thing left is the quiet acknowledgement that she lived a full life without mercy toward herself. Not to be loved more, not to be applauded longer, but to survive it all. And finally, after enduring enough, Serena is allowed to stop, not amid cheers, but in the solemn silence reserved for those who have passed through storms without ever being promised a peaceful harbor. Looking back at the entire story of Serena Williams, the lingering emotion is not the joy of victory, but the sorrow for a person who had to live too long in a state of endurance. Serena was celebrated as the absolute symbol of American strength, but the story itself shows just how heavy the price of that symbol truly was. From her childhood in Compton, amid violence and poverty, where tennis was not a dream but a means of survival, to growing up in a family where failure was not allowed to exist, Serena learned to win before she learned how to be vulnerable. When she dominated Grand Slams, victory no longer brought joy, but became an obligation, because every loss was interpreted as the collapse of an entire archetype. Details like the pulmonary embolism in 2011, or the childbirth complications that nearly took her life when doctors did not believe her words, show that Serena was not only fighting on the court, but also had to protect her own life in a system that did not always listen. Returning to competition before her body had recovered, being both a mother and an icon, trapped her in an inescapable spiral of guilt, where no role felt complete. And when Serena was forced to leave tennis, it was not a free choice, but a necessary stop to avoid self-destruction. The lesson for the American people from this story is very clear. Society glorifies strength, but often forgets the human being behind the symbol. Success should not be built on forcing someone to endure until they break. Serena reminds us that some people do not live for happiness, but live to pave the way, to endure on behalf of an entire community. And the most humane thing society can learn is to know when to grant that person the right to stop in silence and with respect. If you have felt the quiet pain and extraordinary endurance in Serena Williams' journey, please subscribe to the channel and leave a follow as a tribute to those who have lived their entire lives carrying burdens. Thank you for accompanying me until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to tell beautiful but uncomfortable stories about the real price of greatness.